This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm NISSA, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. This week I'm doing something I've never done before. I'm doing an MTG Top 10 on a topic I've already covered. Because of the recent announcement that War of the Spark will have 36 Planeswalkers in it, including one in every pack, I thought it would be a good time to update my MTG Top 10 on Planeswalkers so we can get a feel for where things stand before all these new walkers come out. I did the top 10 on Planeswalkers back in November of 2016. It was around the 30th MTG top 10 I ever did. For reference, this one is 161. So obviously back then I didn't have everything about making these videos figured out. For one thing, the audio was terrible, but for another, I didn't have the methodology I use now completely ironed out. Sure, I gave Pro Tours and Grand Prix the 2 and 1 point respectively that I give them now, but I didn't count Legacy and Vintage Championship events at all, as I only gave points out for Grand Prix and Pro Tour top 8s. This means Vintage couldn't earn any points, and Legacy could only earn a few. I eventually realized this didn't give enough weight to the Eternal formats, and now Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, the way a Pro Tour would be as well. This updated methodology, coupled with new Planeswalkers, upticks in the rate of play of old Planeswalkers, and more over the last 2.5 years have resulted in a very different list. 3 Planeswalkers who didn't make the list last time at all are on it now, and only 2 of those that remained on the list stayed in the exact same spot on the list. Before we get into the list proper, let's take a quick look at the 3 Planeswalkers who got bumped off the list. First, there's CHANDRA, PYROMASTER, who held the number 10 spot on the list from 2016 with 52 points. CHANDRA is a nice Planeswalker who comes with the ability to kill smaller creatures, make larger ones unable to block, and she has the red version of Draw a Card in her Exile the Top Card effect. Her ultimate can end games if your deck has the right composition, but most decks that ran her in Standard were actually aggro decks who could use her to push through the last damage or to keep from running out of gas. She also used to see a lot of play in modern Jund decks, but she hasn't since 2016. Since 2016, CHANDRA Pyromaster has gained a single point, and in the Legacy Dragon Stompy Prison deck of all places, but that wasn't enough to hold on to its spot on the list. The new number 10 on the list has 68 points, so she wasn't especially close. The next walker who fell off of 2016 list is SORIN Solemn Visitor, who is at number 9. SORIN can protect himself with a bat token, pump your whole board and give it lifelink, which can make it pretty difficult for your opponent to race you. It's nice that he gives them lifelink until your turn, because that means you can still block with your bat, for instance, and gain life off of it. His ultimate isn't immediately backbreaking, but it is the kind of thing that snowballs for your opponent. He hasn't gained a single point since the November 2016 list. While in Standard, he saw the most play in Abzan decks, but he hasn't seen play anywhere since rotating, and that's why he fell off the list. The last Planeswalker to fall off of the list was NISSA VASTWOOD SEER, who was at number 7 last time. A flipwalker, NISSA is pretty sweet because she makes sure you hit a land drop as a creature, and then becomes a pretty nice Planeswalker in the late game, capable of drawing you cards and protecting herself with her legendary elemental friend. NISSA falling off of the list doesn't come as a surprise, as she put up all 64 of her points in Standard and collected company decks for the most part, where she was a pretty sweet card to hit with that powerful instant. She hasn't added to her score at all since November 2016, and other Planeswalkers have made it past her. Alright, now that we've got these out of the way, let's move into our top 10, where we begin immediately with a card that didn't make the list last time. And that's KARN, Liberated. Probably the most mentioned Planeswalker in the comments of the old video. Lots of people were disappointed that their favorite walker didn't make the list, but now he's here. KARN is absurdly powerful, if you can get him into play. At 7 mana, that's not always an easy task, but the payoff is definitely worth it. He starts with 6 loyalty, can immediately tick up to 10 while going after your opponent's hand, and he can exile any permanent he feels like. His ultimate is one of the sillier ones, but it can definitely win games in some situations. Decks that have had the most success with KARN are those that can rapidly produce mana. He's most well known for showing up in various modern Tron decks, which can drop KARN on turn 3 and pretty much end the game on the spot. And indeed, that's where the majority of his points are. He's gained 14 points in Modern since the November 2016 list, and he figures to keep putting up points in the format going forward, though he does find himself sometimes competing for a slot in the deck with the number 9 Planeswalker on this list. And that is UGIN, Spirit Dragon. UGIN is one of the 2 cards on the list that hasn't changed its ranking at all. Even though he has gained 16 points since November 2016, he didn't move up at all, but it was enough to hold on to his spot and to barely hold off KARN for the number 9 spot on this list. UGIN is even more expensive to cast than KARN, which means you can't play him on turn 3 with Tron most of the time like you can KARN, but an argument can be made that UGIN is even more powerful. Having the ability to wipe the board the minute he comes down, and then tick up to Lightning Helix your opponent in the face every turn, is a pretty devastating thing to have to happen to you. His ultimate is a thing too, but it doesn't get used all that often. It saw play in assorted mid-range and control decks in Standard, but like KARN, UGIN is probably best known for being in Modern Tron decks these days. Lots of Tron decks in Modern run both UGIN and KARN, which is pretty silly when you think about it. These two are so absurdly powerful, and this deck can cast both of them in a turn 4 format with no problem. Still, since November 2016, UGIN has actually seen slightly more play than KARN in Modern Tron decks, so it will be interesting to see what happens going forward. At number 8, we have Jace Vryn's Prodigy, who was number 6 on the list in November 2016, and has now taken a tumble down to number 8. Only putting up a modest 4 points since the old top 10, it has a real risk of eventually being surpassed by both UGIN and KARN, who are seeing more play than Baby Jace. Still, this Jace is a powerful Planeswalker. As a Flipwalker, he lets you loot in the early game, something that lots of decks love to do, and then he flips into a Planeswalker who can blank your opponent's smaller creatures, and more importantly, who can give spells in your graveyard flashback. He has a pretty underwhelming ultimate, but most of the time, Jace just loots you through your deck and then lets you recast a powerful spell, and that's a lot of value out of one card already. Jace has seen the vast majority of his play in Standard, where he was at his most powerful in a Standard that had fetch lands in it, making flipping him even easier. He saw play in a wide variety of decks too, the most powerful of which was probably Collected Company decks, where he could be put into play by the card, then flip, and cast it again from your graveyard. He also saw play there in a wide variety of control decks. He also has a single point in a Modern Grixis control deck from 2015. The 4 points he has gained, though, are in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage, where he's managed 2 Vintage Championship top 8s since 2016 in Monastery Mentor decks. At number 7, we have our second consecutive Jace to drop 2 spots, with Jace Architect of Thought, who was number 5 in November 2016, at number 7 now. Like Baby Jace, Architect Jace has only managed a meager output since then, with only 2 points added to its score in the last 2.5 years. This Jace is good because he can make it very hard for creatures to kill him with his +1 and give you some serious card advantage with his -2. Like a lot of Jaces, the ultimate here isn't really that great and isn't where the appeal of the card comes from. He put up the vast majority of his points in Standard, where he saw the most play in Devotion to Blue and Blue-White Control. He's also seen play in Modern, primarily in Splinter Twin decks before that deck got banned. The 2 points it has since 2016 are from Modern Grand Prix top 8s and Blue-White Control decks. While it is likely this Jace continues to add to his score, he might want to pick up the pace to avoid being caught by more heavily played Planeswalkers. At number 6, we have a Planeswalker who had only been around for 5 months in November of 2016, and thus wasn't anywhere close to making the list, and that's Liliana of the Last Hope, who is the second new Planeswalker to make the list. At only 3 mana, Liliana the Last Hope gives you lots of power for such a low cost. She has a +1 that kills small creatures and a -2 that lets you draw cards and load up your graveyard. Her ultimate is at its best in zombie tribal decks, and not all decks that run her can really take advantage of that, but when she saw play in Standard, she did see play in zombie tribal decks, as well as in the graveyard-based Golgari Delirium deck. While she saw a good amount of play in Standard, her 46 points in that format would not have gotten her especially close to the list. Instead, she managed to find her way onto this list thanks to seeing play in Legacy and Modern as well. Since 2016, the Death's Shadow deck has emerged as one of the top tier decks in Modern, and Liliana has been around for much of that ride. The deck likes to load up its graveyard to fuel cards with Delve, and Liliana can help with that while also clearing out any problem blockers. She's also seen play in Legacy, including in a blue-black version of Death's Shadow in that format, and in Bug and Grixis Delver decks. At number 5, we have the card to take the biggest tumble from the last list, and that's Elspeth Sun's Champion. She stood at number 1 on this list in November 2016, and it isn't like she's been completely idle or anything. She's actually added 9 points to her score since then, but it wasn't enough to hold on to that number 1 spot, or number 2, or number 3. You get the picture. Elspeth, despite the fact that she is no longer number 1 on the list, is a great Planeswalker. Her +1 makes you 3 creature tokens, who can both protect her and pressure your opponent quickly. Her -3 can deal with large problem creatures, and her ultimate can turn all her soldier friends into a one-hit kill. Standard is where she saw the vast majority of her play. She has 110 points in that format, and that's a big reason why she hasn't been able to keep up with the cards in front of her, who all see play in a multitude of other formats with more regularity. Despite not seeing play at a hugely impressive rate compared to the walkers in front of her, Elspeth has turned herself into a consistent performer in Modern since November 2016, where she's been a win condition for Blue-White Control and Jeskai Control decks. At number 4, we have the second 3-mana Liliana, Liliana of the Veil, who, somewhat surprisingly to me, actually fell a spot on this list, dropping from number 3 to number 4. This happened despite the fact that she has put up 20 points since November 2016, so that should tell you something about the cards in front of her. Like Liliana, the Last Hope, this Liliana gives you a ton of value on turn 3, and she's pretty hard to beat when she comes down that early. She can come into play, make your opponent sacrifice their only creature, and then start increasing her loyalty and making players discard cards. Then, her ultimate can completely reshape the board, and it can get there surprisingly quickly. While she saw a lot of play in the Standard over day, she was probably the most successful in the various Jund decks of that format, but in the end in Standard she only earned 35 points. Modern is really where Liliana has done the most work. She has been a fixture there since the format began in 2011, and she's been a key card in Modern Jund decks, with some top 8s along the way as well, in Gifts Control, Abzan, and Death's Shadow. She's also seen some play in Legacy Jund, as well as in various bug decks in the format. In 2017, she managed her first Vintage Championship top 8 too, in a bug control deck. She's going to continue to see play, and probably won't ever fall off of this list, but I'm not sure she'll ever catch the 3 in front of her either, who are all still seeing play and already have a huge lead. At number 3, we have a card that had only existed for 2 months in November 2016, and that shows you it has done a lot of work since then, and that's CHANDRA, Torch of Defiance. She was super hyped when she was spoiled, and she pretty much lived up to the hype. Planeswalkers with 4 abilities come with some additional flexibility, and CHANDRA definitely gives you that. Her first +1 either gives you card advantage or does some damage to your opponent. Her second +1 helps you ramp. Her -3 kills a bunch of creatures, and she has a pretty nice ultimate. She was ubiquitous in Standard, and that has gone a long way towards giving her such a massive score. She picked up 154 points in that format alone, seeing play in the various vehicle and energy decks of that time, as well as more traditional red aggro decks like Ramunap Red and Rakdos Aggro. However, she has also seen play in Modern and Legacy, showing that she is by no means done adding to her score. In Modern, she has put up top 8s in Jund and Scapeshift decks, and in Legacy, she has operated as a win condition in Dragon Stompy Prison decks. It will be interesting to see, going forward, if she can do enough to hold off Liliana. At number 2, we have a Planeswalker who maintained his spot from the last list, and that's Gideon, ally of ZENDIKAR, who's still at number 2. In November of 2016, he was wreaking havoc in Standard, and that's something he kept doing until he rotated. He was just one of the most powerful cards around the entire time he was in Standard. However, he has proven strong enough to see play in other formats as well, and that's what enabled him to stay ahead of CHANDRA. In total, Gideon has put up 57 points since the last list. Gideon's ability to churn out 2/2 creatures to protect himself and pressure your opponent, plus the ability to rumble himself, makes him pretty nice. He also is interesting in that he has an ultimate you can use the minute you play him. And sure, it isn't a game-breaking ultimate, but sometimes an anthem for your whole team is what you need to win a game. His highlights in Standard came in decks like Abzan, Selesnya Tokens, and Mardu Vehicles. He's also picked up top 8s in Modern in decks like Abzan, Junk, and Hate Bear. He also sees play in Legacy's Death and Taxes and Miracles. He even sees play in Vintage Landstill decks, where if you can stick Gideon ahead of Standstill, he can just churn out allies, which will eventually make your opponent have to play a spell. Gideon is going to keep adding points to his score as time goes by, but I don't think he'll ever catch the number 1 card on this list. At number 1, we have the card to make the biggest jump up the list, and that's Jace the Mind Sculptor, who moved from number 4 to number 1, and has 118 more points now than he did in the 2016 list. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that last time around I didn't count Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s, so those alone gave him a lot more points when I went back and looked at him. The other is that he got unbanned in Modern, letting him add to his score a bit more in that format while continuing to see a ton of play in both Legacy and Vintage. Jace is considered by many to be the most powerful Planeswalker ever, so him being at number 1 isn't too much of a surprise. He has 4 abilities. One of them is a Fate Seal effect where you can use him to control your or your opponent's draws while rapidly upticking his loyalty. He can also bounce creatures and Brainstorm, and his ultimate can serve as a legitimate win condition if the game lasts long enough. While in Standard, he only put up 56 points. But this was largely because he was so dominant, helping to make Cobblade one of the most dominant decks Standard has ever seen, that he got banned after only a year in Standard. In Extended, his primary home was in Fairies decks. He's seen a ton of play in Legacy ever since being printed, having seen play in a variety of Stoneblade, Miracle, and Control decks. The same is true in Vintage. A good sign a Planeswalker is overpowered is probably that it sees play in Vintage pretty much the moment it gets printed, and that's what Jace did, seeing play in Landstill and Monastery Mentor decks. Since being unbanned in Modern, Jace has seen play in combo decks like Nightfall and Scapeshift, as well as in Blue-White Control. He has a firm grip at the #1 spot on this list, since he has a large lead and is still incredibly active. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. It was interesting to go back to an old list and update it. It's probably something I'll do again in the future. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to watch old MTG Top 10s, including the 2016 edition of Top 10 Planeswalkers, you should be able to find the playlist for MTG Top 10s on the screen right now. Thanks for watching.